Hello there. Welcome to the Africa Rights Talk podcast, a Center for Human Rights podcast series exploring a range of human rights issues through conversations with academics, practitioners, and activists. I am your host, Victoria Amaechi. Let's dive in. This podcast is hopefully it's going to be the ninth episode of the Africa Rights Talk podcast. The theme or the topic of this conversation would be breaking the silence, women's rights and mental health in Africa. Yeah. So we try to do this conversation in honor of Women's Month. How is your Women's Month going so far?
So far, it hasn't even set in yet.
Yeah, okay.
But so far, so I can't complain. I don't have any complaints, at least.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, all right, yeah, okay. I mean, I guess so. So in celebration of Women's Month, this episode of Africa Rights Talk would delve into the often overlooked but deeply personal intersection between mental health and women's rights. And across Africa, many women navigate complex realities, gender-based violence, poverty, social stigma, and systemic inequality that directly affects their mental well-being. Yet, conversations around mental health are still shrouded in silence, especially within policy and right-based frameworks. We're joined today by my colleague, Bianca Knight. They are project officer at the Women's Rights Unit at the Center for Human Rights. Join us to unpack how mental health is just not a personal matter, but a critical human rights issue. So drawing from her work and the things that she does in the unit, she will highlight the challenges, overlooked narratives, and emerging advocacy in the African context. And we're going to reflect on what a feminist, right-based approach to mental health looks like and how we can center care and healing. So off to a good start. I don't know if you can do us a favor and tell us more about yourself. If you can start off by telling us what you do as a project officer at the Women's Rights Unit.
Yeah. Yes, thank you for having me, Vicky. Thank you for introducing me. That was very kind of you. So I work as a project officer in the Women's Rights Unit at the Center for Human Rights, University of Pretoria. And our work mainly focuses on advocating for the Maputo Protocol, which is a protocol to the African Charter dealing specifically with women's rights on the African context, on the African continent, taking into account the lived experiences and cultural roots of African women. So I would say the protocol is definitely one of the most progressive human rights instruments that exist, and more so especially for women. So we do state report training, we do shadow report training on how to draft state reports and focus then on specific articles in the Maputo Protocol that might be sensitive, like, for example, Article 14 that deals with health and sexual and reproductive health as well. Yes, and then we do other training as well regarding and advocacy campaigns on women's rights, child, for example, highlighting issues such as child marriage, FGM experiences on the continent, obstetric violence, to create awareness on these issues.
Thank you for that introduction to what you do. I think the work that you do at the unit is very, very much important. There's a lot of work to be done around emancipating and enhancing and empowering women in the society, especially in the African society. So I do appreciate the work that you do. So to start off, what does Women's Month personally and professionally mean to you, especially in the context of the work that you do at the Women's Rights Unit?
So Women's Month is both a moment of reflection and renewed commitment for me. It goes personally and professionally as well. Just reflecting on where I came from, where I got to today, and just renewing my commitment to women's rights going forward as well. And at the Women's Rights Unit, it is a powerful reminder of the resilience and leadership of African women, especially those whose voices are often unheard. And it challenges us to go beyond symbolic gestures, and focus on systemic change, amplifying the implementation of instruments like the Maputo Protocol and addressing urgent issues such as women's mental health. And so for me, it's a call to honor the women who came before us by ensuring that the next generation inherits a more just, inclusive, and dignified world.
Thank you for that, Bianca. I agree. There's a lot to do around the Maputo Protocol. It's a very important and very powerful instrument, and it's so unlucky that a lot of important countries in the continent have not still ratified that protocol. So I believe that, and especially I don't know if it's been integrated into the protocol, the mental health aspects of women. Is it? Okay, I'm not sure. Yeah, okay, that's good. That's actually very great to know. Thank you for that. So mental health is still a taboo topic in African society, especially when it comes to women. A lot of women are going through a lot, having to be providers of their family, having to take care of the children, and in addition to being a proper member of the society. Why do you think this taboo or this silence persists, and how does it affect how does it impact women's ability to seek help or speak out about mental health concerns?
So you're very much right in saying that it is taboo. So mental health remains a highly stigmatized in many African societies, and especially for women, and this silence persists for several interconnected reasons. Firstly, we have cultural beliefs and traditional norms. Mental illness is often seen as a weakness, a spiritual possession, or a curse rather than a medical condition. So in many communities, people turn first towards traditional healers or religious leaders instead of mental health professionals that are able to give them the help that they need and deserve. Secondly, we still deal, unfortunately, with gendered expectations and societal roles. Traditional gender roles often frame women as resilient caregivers, as you said, whose emotional struggles aren't taken seriously. Expressing distress may be seen as a sign of failing at that role. Women who seek help risk being labeled as weak, unstable, or unfit, which reinforces this silence and self-stigma. And thirdly, the lack of awareness and under-resourced systems. Mental health care is consistently deprioritized in policy, in funding, and training across many African countries. Access is limited, particularly for women in rural areas, leaving very few safe entry points of care. So, institutional stigma further reinforces this neglect and leading to persistent treatment gaps. And this obviously does have a major impact on women. Firstly, it creates a barrier to seeking help. The fear of social rejection and misunderstanding, especially for women dealing with issues like obstetric violence, gender-based violence, or trauma from female genital mutilation and child marriage, it discourages them from reaching out for support, and many prefer to stay silent rather than face that stigma. And secondly, it exacerbates the mental health burden that these women face. Without the help that they need, women may internalize the shame and guilt, which worsens their anxiety, depression, or trauma. Their suffering is so often overlooked and unacknowledged and untreated, and it leads to even deeper emotional harm. And then thirdly, the social and economic exclusion. Stigma can lead to isolation from family and the community, reduced economic opportunities, and limit access to education or support networks. So in healthcare settings, women may even avoid care altogether to prevent being labeled or judged. Silence around this mental health persists in part due to entrenched cultural beliefs, gender norms, and under-resourced healthcare systems. And it affects women disproportionately in many ways. It discourages them from speaking out, or it prevents them from getting timely access to care, and it just compounds their mental health burden even further.
Thank you for giving a very candid perspective as to why women stay silent to their mental health concerns. I agree. And I feel like this conversation is very important, and whoever gets to listen should to hope that they're able to speak out and not fall prey to expectations of women as resilient, even though they are like going through so much. So I agree with you. Thank you for that perspective. So from your experience, how do gender-based violence, poverty, discrimination show up in mental health struggles of African women? And what are the stories or patterns that you may have, engaged with, or that's actually stuck with you when you engage in those um, experiences?
Excellent question. So,
Yeah.
from my experience working in the women's rights advocacy and human rights education, I've seen how gender-based violence, poverty, and discrimination are deeply, deeply interwoven into the mental health struggles of many of these African women. And these challenges don't exist in isolation. They compound on one another that creates a cycle that is both structural and very deeply personal. So, in terms of gender-based violence, women who survive domestic abuse, sexual violence, or harmful practices like child marriage or female genital mutilation or obstetric violence often carry invisible psychological scars like trauma, shame, anxiety, and depression, and it goes untreated. So, in many cases, survivors are silenced or blamed, which often deeply deepens their isolation. Their suffering is often normalized or dismissed as it's just a part of life. Deal with it, get over it. So, in my work, I've witnessed how mental health is the missing piece in the response to gender based violence. So, yes, there are legal remedies and shelter supports that do exist in some places, but psychological healing is rarely prioritized or resourced. There's not enough resources available, or it's just not prioritized. So, in terms of poverty, it amplifies mental health challenges in very real ways for women. A woman, like you said, struggling to feed her children or access basic healthcare often doesn't have the language, the time, or the space to address her emotional well-being. So the mental distress becomes chronic, and yet it stays invisible to the outside world. Poverty also limits access to any kind of mental health support, especially in rural areas. Clinics may be understaffed or lack trained professionals, and if the few services that do exist they're often unaffordable, so many women don't have access to mental health care at clinics. And then in terms of discrimination, whether it be cultural, racial, based on sexual orientation or disability or even age, the discrimination has a cumulative effect on women's mental health. So many African women face multiple layers of marginalization, being poor, for example, being a black woman, living in a rural area, being a migrant woman, or being a woman part of the LGBTQI plus community. And these intersecting identities often lead to exclusion from healthcare, unfair treatment, and internalized stigma. Women are often shamed for opening up about their emotional pain, especially in communities where mental health is seen as a taboo or where it is associated with spiritual failure or weakness. And this silence then fuels loneliness and despair. And the stories and patterns that stay with me most are the quiet stories, the women who hold everything together for their families while battling inner struggles. And in this sense, I can speak from personal experience. I've had to keep my emotional struggles, anxiety, and feelings of loneliness hidden during difficult times and be strong and supportive towards my family. So then again, like you said, with my mom, I learned that behavior from my mom. She had to be strong for our family when we were small, had to be strong, had to cry alone in a room, had to show no weakness in these difficult times. And that behavior is just being transported now on to the next generation of women. So, yes, we learn from our mothers, and this behavior just sort of continues from one generation to the next. Be strong. Don't cry when you're having feelings. Don't cry when you're angry. Don't cry when you're sad. Don't cry when you're hurt. And I mean, these feelings are all normal. We're all human. We all feel them. And somehow we're stigmatized for having these very strong emotions, not being able to show our emotions or express our feelings of internal pain, anxiety, or depression. We have to wake up every morning at 6, get the kids ready for school, come back, do a full-time job. It never ends. And when do you find that time to then say, okay, reflect, what about me? Where's the time for women to say that, listen, I need to take a 5-minute break, or I need medication to help me through my mental health struggles. And another pattern I see repeatedly is how women's resilience is often mistaken for wellness. Because women are so often in these caregiving roles, their suffering is hidden or devalued. There's this unspoken belief that being strong means never needing help, not experiencing anxiety or depression or burnout. We're just expected to keep it together for the well-being and livelihood of the family around us who rely on us, our friends, colleagues at work, in all the spaces that women find themselves in.
Yes, I can tell that this is a passionate or impassioned conversation, and I really would love to listen for like a longer period, but we are pressed with time, so we have to keep it within the time frame. Yes, thank you about that. And to talk about legal and policy frameworks, when it comes to rights. But like, how do you think we need to design or begin to integrate mental health into the broader like women's rights agenda, not just having them in, in treaties, in protocols, and how do we envision in a larger scale an African human rights system pertaining to women rights issues? How would you envision mental health as a form of policy in those instruments? How do you think that would look like in practice? Yeah.
So this is a very important and timely question. And for way too long, mental health has been seen as a separate or a secondary issue, a soft concern in the broader struggle of women's rights in Africa. But if we truly believe in dignity, equality, and the full realization of human rights, then mental health must be viewed as a core component of human rights and not as an afterthought. So firstly, we need to reframe mental health as a human right. This is the first step. It's a consensual step. We need to treat mental health as a fundamental right, just like we treat the right to education, to safety, and bodily autonomy. So the African Charter and the Maputo Protocol already affirm the right to health, which includes mental health and well-being. But states and institutions must explicitly include psychosocial well-being under this umbrella. Just as we fight for protection against gender-based violence or sexual and reproductive health rights, such as abortion or access to contraceptive, etc., we must also advocate for the right to mental well-being, especially for women and girls who find themselves faced with compounded vulnerabilities as well. So in terms of policy integration, it means we need to embed mental health into gender policies so that National action plans on gender-based violence or sexual reproductive health rights include counseling, trauma support, and community-based mental health resources. We need education policies that ensure that girls and young women receive mental health education and access to school-based psychosocial support. We need social protection programs where mental health care is bundled into services for survivors, for caregivers, and women living in poverty or displacement. It's about mainstreaming mental health into every space where women's rights are discussed or implemented. So what it would look like in practice is that community health workers trained in basic psychosocial care, especially in rural areas where there are no psychologists or social workers, we need safe spaces for women to share their stories, led by trained facilitators, where healing is seen as a collective process. We need trauma-informed legal and health services. For example, police officers or nurses who understand the psychological toll of gender-based violence and respond appropriately with care towards that these women deserve. And then we need cultural sensitive mental health messaging delivered in local languages through trusted community channels like churches, radio stations, and schools, so we can start to break down the stigma that surrounds mental health and mental well-being. In the advocacy and capacity building work I've been involved in through the Center for Human Rights, I've seen how integrating a mental health lens deepens our impact. Whether we're training state actors on the Maputo Protocol or working on shadow reports, bringing in this psychosocial perspectives helps ground our work in the lived realities of African women. And who should be leading this integration, right? It's government. Government must allocate enough resources and budget, and they must possess the political will to care. NGOs and human rights organizations should form partnerships with mental health professionals. Academia can even contribute evidence-based strategies that is rooted in the African context. And most importantly, women with lived experience must be part of the design and the delivery of these solutions.
Yeah, I was about to reiterate, but I think you already mentioned it, like the importance of having the impact-based solutions. So, for instance, now you want to make an impact on women, you want to make an impact of the local community, they have to be very much present in every stage of that implementation. So thank you for that. I think it's I like how you broke down clearly how it looks like, and I could see really, really clearly. And I don't know why it's so hard for stakeholders, the government, and people that have the power to implement this. And I don't know why it takes that toll to implement something that you could, if you properly sit down, you can get a clarity as to how you can actually implement this in practice. But I hope we get there someday. Getting to my last question, before I don't want to take too much of your time, is if you could reimagine the future of feminist advocacy on the continent, what role would care, healing, and mental wellness play in it? And what gives you hope right now?
Oh, that's one of the difficult questions. If I could reimagine the future of feminist advocacy in Africa regarding care, healing, and mental wellness, it would be at the center and not at the margins of our movements. Feminism on the continent has long been rooted in resistance and survival, but the next chapter must also prioritize restoration. So what this means is to advocate for spaces where women are not just called on to be resilient, but are supported to rest, to process trauma, and to receive the emotional and psychological care they deserve. A truly intersectional feminist future recognizes that we cannot talk about justice without also addressing the invisible wounds carried by women, especially those impacted by violence, poverty, and systemic exclusion. And what gives me hope right now is that a new generation of African feminists is already doing this work, whether it's through community-led mental health projects, wellness circles, or survivor-led advocacy. There's a growing recognition that healing is revolutionary. I see women using storytelling, art, therapy, and indigenous knowledge systems to reclaim their well-being. And it's this shift from endurance to wholeness that reminds me of our movements they're evolving. We're making small steps, but at least we are making some steps. We're not only fighting injustice, we're building futures where women can thrive emotionally and mentally in their full dignity.
Thank you for that. I'm very much would now after this conversation want to Google how those indigenous systems work with mental health. That's a very interesting school of thought of imagining healing and imagining mental health. I think that's a very interesting perspective. Yeah, thank you so much for your insights. And my last thing is if you have any concluding remarks in the whole scheme of mental health.
So
Yeah.
I thought a lot about this, and I think
Yeah.
touched on the stigma of mental health and how we're going to break that cycle. I think I'm going to be now very vulnerable, but I mean, it should start somewhere. And I gentle parented myself to say that, listen, don't be ashamed. Before this podcast, I took anxiety medication because I felt stressed. In the morning, I have to take antidepressants because my anxiety levels are through the roof, and the antidepressants work well with the anxiety medication. I'm also on Concerta, which is ADHD medication, and you know what? It works for me. I'm okay. And it's normal. It's okay to have mental health issues.
Issues. Yeah.
So
It is
let's
okay.
start by
The
destigmatizing.
stigma, yeah.
Let's start by having the conversation on, listen, if you're feeling anxious, you don't have to feel this way. You don't have to go through this alone. There are many people who have the same struggles. We just don't talk about it. Let's start having these important conversations, especially for women who keep everything inside, bundle it all up, and try to keep it together. Let's talk about anxiety. Let's talk about depression. Let's open up about it and destigmatize this whole concept of it's a taboo. It doesn't exist. It's not real. It very much is real, and it very much is a mental condition that you can treat. So that's my concluding remarks.
No, thank you for being vulnerable. A lot of people are gonna relate to the conversation. Even me, let me also be vulnerable right here too. Last month I had to also get on some meds because I never imagined that I would need them. But when you get to that point where you be like, I need help, and I need to feel like myself. It's okay to have those struggles and seek help and want to feel like yourself. I'm for sure a lot of people are gonna share that same sentiment with me. So thank you so much, Bianca, for your insightful and very interesting perspectives to this theme, this topic, and I look forward to having more conversations outside of the podcast about this.
Thank you so much for having me, Vic.
I guess
this was a wonderful experience. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
You have just listened to the Africa Rights Talk podcast. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Do not forget to subscribe to our YouTube channels, social media platforms such as Twitter and Instagram. Thank you for listening.